Welcome to Deathly Honest, the podcast where we get real about the parts of life we often avoid: aging, death, and grief. Here, we strip away the cliches, drop the euphemisms, and dive into the truths most people keep at arm's length. This isn't just a place for somber reflections. It's a raw, profound, and sometimes darkly humorous exploration of the journey we all face. Whether it's tackling the messy emotions that come with loss, confronting the fears around mortality, or finding a laugh in life's most challenging transitions, Deathly Honest is here to make these conversations easier, one episode at a time. So grab your favorite beverage, a box of tissues, and your most beloved comfort item, and let's get deathly honest together. So I decided to hop on here and record an episode 0 of Deathly Honest to introduce you to myself and to the podcast and why I'm doing this and what I hope to do with the podcast. And I'm just going to wing it. I don't have any text to follow, so we're just going to see where this goes. My name's Kelli Lyles. I have been a grief counselor for about 14 years. I do lots of different kinds of counseling, but grief is really what I'm very, very passionate about. Having said that, I think that almost anything that comes up in a counseling office can be tied back to some sort of grief. So I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, and my master's degree is actually in gerontology. So I am a gerontologist. I am very passionate about aging, death, and grief. And it's where I spend a lot of time. And so I, over the years, have heard so many stories. I've talked to so many people struggling with different kinds of grief. And I decided I have a platform to allow me to tell those stories. So that's what this podcast is to allow people to tell their stories about aging, about death and dying, and about grief. And they're going to be people that come from all different walks of life, different people that I know and have met through different ways. It is going to be primarily an audio podcast, simply because I want people to be able to come on and tell their story and not worry about what they look like, or, if they're coming off, ugly crying, whatever we want to call it, right? So it's going to be primarily audio. I will sometimes record a video like this to kind of preview the episode. Sometimes I will do that in audio too. I don't really have plans one way or the other as to how I'm going to do it, but it's really just a storytelling podcast. And I'm going to give a lot of credit to Anderson Cooper. If you know who Anderson Cooper is, he has a lovely, lovely podcast called All There Is. And I would highly recommend it. So his stories, he's been telling stories of people for the past 3 seasons, and they're, many of them are celebrities and people that he knows through various places of his life. I don't have those contacts, right? But the big thing about it that I've loved is to watch Anderson go through his own grief process through this podcast that he's got. So, yeah, if you haven't done that, I'm selling his podcast. Listen to mine too, maybe, but that's kind of the idea here too, is just to tell stories. And they're just going to be people who, I come in contact with. And I believe it's very important to speak about it, to say what you've experienced, to share feelings. I am a big feeler of feelings, and I feel very strongly that we need to be feeling our feelings out loud. We live in a society here in the United States that keeps grief very quiet. People don't want to talk about it. And that makes it harder. We've lost rituals. Um, we just sort of do it quietly in our own little space. And I would like people to grieve out loud. So, just briefly, so you can kind of understand where I come from, I say that I feel like grief and death have been part of my life for most of it. I was always a kid that was very fascinated by cemeteries. Um, I used to go to the old part of the cemetery where my grandparents are buried here in Central Washington State. And my mom would just let me go, and I would just go back and I would uncover old graves that were covered up by shrubs and have been overgrown. And I was just fascinated by them, about the history of the people that had died, and we're now at a place where there weren't even family members around to maintain their graves anymore. So um I love those old cemeteries with the old graves that people have to maintain. Unfortunately, after time goes on and there aren't people around to do that anymore, sometimes they get overgrown. Now we live in more of a society where people are cremated, or there's a lot of different ways you can handle bodies after they die. And so we don't have necessarily the graves to go to maintain. Both my parents are in a little niche at their cemetery. They both were cremated, and they're just in this little hole in the wall of a circular, I don't even know what it's called. I don't know what those things are called, that hold all of cremated remains. And so I go out there, and it's important to me to be able to go out there and I can put my hand on their names, but it's not a maintaining of a grave site like my parents used to do every year. Memorial Day was a big party when I was growing up, because my parents would go over to the cemetery and they would meet with their siblings, and then people from all over the town would come around, and that's when people got together. And it was like a tailgate party. People would come in their pickup trucks and drop the tailgates, and there were coolers of beer and food, and everybody was getting together and laughing and joking and having fun while they were cleaning up grave sites. That was my childhood. um, so I feel like I've always had a part of me that just death and dying was around me. I remember learning about death at a very young age and became very, probably obsessed with it, with my own death and the fact that people I loved were going to die. And I was just one of those kids who thought about it a lot, who talked about it a lot. I talked about it a lot in ways I didn't talk about it, I think, with my parents, because I think I tried and they just sort of like, we don't need to talk about this. Um, I was always kind of that kid in my family, that wanted to talk about more things than other people wanted to talk about. That's probably why I'm here today. So to back up a little bit, I talked about, my parents both having their ashes somewhere. So obviously they are not alive. My mother died in 2009. She was diagnosed with cancer in March and died in October. She had been given a 3-month diagnosis. It was stage 4 when they found it. We didn't even know what kind of cancer it was. She was diagnosed with cancer of undiagnosed origin until she died, and as she continued through her time with cancer, it became more and more clear that it was ovarian cancer. And so her death certificate does say ovarian cancer. But by the time they caught it, it was metastasized throughout her body. And so I was actually in a really rough place with my mom when she was diagnosed. And I just sort of dropped everything and decided I was going to get all the answers I needed from her. I was going to find out all the information that I needed to understand my own life better. And that's not at all what happened. She was given a 3-month diagnosis if she chose not to do chemo, or maybe a year if she chose to do chemo. And she did not want to do chemo. And my dad begged her to. So she did it. It almost killed her. They told her they were going to give her the lightest amount you could give somebody. She wouldn't lose her hair. She wouldn't be sick. She was very, very sick. She ended up in the hospital. She was vomiting blood across the room.
And by the time I got to the hospital, her blood pressure was 49/27. And I can see it now. I can look back over that time and see it now that the two nurses that were attending to her were really trying to keep her alive. My dad was completely oblivious. I was not fully paying attention. I knew it was bad, but I wasn't fully paying attention. Um, so she ended up in the hospital. She was in the NICU for about 3 days and then in the cancer ward for a few more days. And when she was in the NICU, when she was awake enough, um, a doctor came in and said to my dad, if this was my wife, I would tell her to stop chemo. And I think my mom wanted to just hug that doctor. She told us, she goes, no more. And I think my dad was still like, okay, but we could still, and then that doctor said that, and that was the end. There was no more chemo. So that was April. She came home shortly before my 40th birthday. I went up and spent my 40th birthday with her. She did not know it was my birthday. Um, that process of chemo and it really took a lot out of her. And it took her probably a month or so to recover from that. And then we had a really great summer. And I spent a lot of time with my parents that summer. And all the things I was upset with my mom about didn't matter anymore um, at that time. And she got sicker, she got sicker at the end of September, quite honestly. She was good from about June to September. And at the end of September, we had to go in a couple of times over the summer because one thing ovarian cancer does, as some other cancers do, but one certainly with ovarian cancer is that her abdomen would fill up with fluid. And so she had to get it drained out. And so we would go do that together because my dad could not handle it. And so I would sit with her and I would just hold her hand. It's not a great procedure. They have to stick a needle in, and they were draining 6 liters of fluid out of her. There was one point where I think they took 8, and she was so dizzy and everything afterwards that her doctor said no more than 6. We don't take any more than 6, but 6 liters of fluid. Um, so we did that a couple of times over the summer because it would make it really hard for her to breathe. And then there was the last time we did it, I smile because that's all I can do about it now. But the last time we did it, we went in and it started the process, and as they look like big jugs of what the color it used to look like was kind of a light beer. But as the jugs were filling up, it was red. And I knew, I was like, well, that's not good. And so I asked the tech that was in there, which was totally unfair. But I said, so it used to be kind of like a light beer color, and now it's this red. And he goes, oh, no, that's not a big deal. We don't worry about it unless it's like a deep, like cherry red. And as the the containers are filling up, it's very obvious it's dark cherry red. And he just kind of stood in there silent, and none of us said anything because it was clearly, when it first started, it looked sort of strawberry red, but as it was filling, it was cherry red. And I still think about him all the time because I think, oh my gosh, that poor kid went out after that appointment and was like, why did I say anything? And um, but I kind of look back at it as something sort of funny. But I knew something had turned, and shortly thereafter, at the end of September, my mom's back started bothering her, and she told me she thought she had done too much weeding, and we all kind of knew. Um, it was at the very end of September that she called me, or I called her. I think I was calling them every single night, and she knew, that things had turned, and we cried on the phone together. It's been 15 years, you guys. Um, this is grief. And we cried on the phone together, and she said, I love you, Kelli. And that was the last time she said it. And I remember it. I remember what it sounded like. And for two people who had a very, very complicated relationship, I needed to hear that. Um, and what I tell people all the time is that I spent those 7 months at the beginning thinking I was going to get all these answers, right? And I feel like my mom and I solved all of our stuff without saying much of anything. The one thing my mom did do was we were at an appointment. I have two sons that had to go do all of this with me because they were, I think, 11 and 7 at the time. And I drug them up across, I lived about an hour and a half away from my parents down I-5. We call it I-5 up here, not the 5. So I would have to drive through Seattle on I-5 twice a day, up once and back once. And there were times we spent 3 or 4 hours just traveling. And so my boys would come with me. And there was one particular appointment at the doctor's office where uh, my mom was looking at my boys. She was facing them, and I was standing right behind her. And she knew I was standing right behind her. And she said to my sons, it made me cry too. It always does. I cannot tell this story without making me cry. She said to my sons, your mom is a much better mom to you than I ever was to her. Don't forget that. And I stood there thinking, what's happening right now? Like, what is happening right now? She couldn't look at me and say it, but she needed me to hear it. And so I needed to hear that. I needed to know that she knew. Now, my mom was not an awful person. She wasn't even an awful mother. She just was somebody who didn't want children. That's for a whole nother story as to why I'm even here. But she did a really great job being a mother to kids. She had two kids. I have a younger brother, to two kids that she didn't really want. And she really was terrified of having a daughter. So there was a lot of generational trauma in my lifetime. So I was there the day my mom died. I didn't expect to be. I was also a birth doula at the time, and I had been at my parents' house and had to leave suddenly because I had a client call me and her water had broken and she was really hoping I could be there. And so I left my mom's deathbed and drove to this birth thinking to myself, my mom's going to die while I'm at this birth. And it was a weird time in my life because I was a birth doula and a childbirth educator. And I was teaching childbirth classes and telling people the same things that the hospice nurses were telling me when I would go, how are we going to know when it's happening? What's it going to look like? What's it going to sound like? That's what people ask in childbirth classes. And I would say, I can give you some generalities, but everything's unique. Everyone's individual. And that's what the hospice nurses were telling me, right? So when my parents called to tell me my mom had cancer, I was at the birth center where I was teaching classes, and I took the call because my parents never called me. And I immediately went out and taught a childbirth class 2 minutes later. And I'd been teaching for so long that I'm pretty sure I did that class, with my brain not there. But I just did it. And so I worked in this field of birth while my mom was dying. And it was very profound because they are so linked. And I've said forever, as somebody who's been in a lot of birth rooms, that I feel like death stands in every birth room because there is such a thin veil that happens in a birth room that death kind of just stands in the corner and waits to see if they're needed. And sometimes they are, most times they're not. But I think as somebody who feels very connected to death, I could feel that in almost every birth room I was in. Anyway, I had left my mom's deathbed to go to this birth. The midwife that was at this birth at the hospital was my angel that night because I told her, and her mom had either just died or had died not that long ago. And she knew me, but she really took care of me that night. She checked on me. She made sure I was drinking and eating, all while doing her job. And she and I we'd known each other for a while and we had different personalities, but I always really liked her. But that night, she was my angel. This baby was born. It had some difficulties. It had to go to the NICU. And the next day, I was there most of the night. And then I went home, I slept a little bit, and I was like, do I want to drive up there? And something just said, yes, you do. And so I put my kids in the car and I drove up there. And hospice had brought in a harpist while my mom was in the hospital. And so they'd asked me if we wanted the harpist to come. And I was like, sure. And so the harpist came that day. And the harpist is playing, and it's just me and the harpist and my mom in this room. My mom's on a hospital bed in the living room. My dad was in the garage doing something to distract himself. My kids were in another room playing on their video games. Um, and as the harpist starts to play, my mom's breathing changes. And the harpist stops and she says, has she been doing this all day? And I went, no, this is brand new. And I didn't know anything about um, like death breathing, end of life breathing. And so I know now. um, and so she played a little bit more, and the breathing got more labored. And she went, I think I'm going to stop. I feel like I'm maybe making things worse. And so I'm just going to go. And I went, okay. And she told me later that she went out into the driveway, got her harp out of the house, packed it all up, and got into the driveway and called the hospice and said, she's dying right now. Uh, I didn't know that. And so I had called hospice because I'm like, something's happening. I don't know what she's doing. And they said, that sounds like end of life breathing. And I remember saying, end of life now? And uh, they said, yeah. And I had a picture that like hospice was going to be there. We weren't going to be by ourselves. How are we going to do this by ourselves? Just like birth. And so I brought my dad in from the garage and I said, they said that this is end of life breathing. And we did everything wrong. I think about this all the time because we were basically screaming at my mother to cough. She was comatose. She'd been on morphine. She hadn't said a word in days. And we thought maybe if she just coughed, that she'd live. I don't know. I don't know what we were thinking at the time, but that went on for a short period of time and then it just stopped. And then she was gone. Um, and I took her pulse. I can't even tell you how many times I took her pulse. It was never there. um, all the things that happen after a body dies started happening. There was some foaming of the mouth, and I knew she was dead, and yet I still needed to take that pulse over and over and over again. And this is one of the reasons, this will be for another conversation too, but why I support home funerals, because there is research that talks about if a body remains in a home for 3 days, it allows our brains to acknowledge that the person has died. Because we had a funeral home come out, and they took her body probably within a couple of hours of her dying. I had called my brother and sister-in-law. They came down. I did not know that my brother did not want to see my dead mom. And I talk about that a lot because I wanted to be there. I felt really blessed to be able to be there when she died. My brother did not want that. And we have to remember those things about people, that we all need different things. I think that kind of traumatized my brother. So I was there when my mom died. I was also there when my dad died. My dad died 6 years later, almost to the day. He had Parkinson's. We knew he had Parkinson's when my mom had died, but my mom was 73, which felt very young. My dad was 78. My parents had known each other since they were 6. They grew up across the street from each other. I didn't know until I was in kindergarten that everybody's grandparents didn't live directly across the street from each other, because kids would go, yeah, well, we're going to my mom's mom and dad for, Christmas, and then we're going to my dad's mom and dad for Thanksgiving or whatever. And I was always like, why don't you just walk across the street? I don't understand why you can't do the holidays together. And then at some point I realized I was the weird one who had grandparents that lived directly across the street from each other in a little small town. So my parents had known each other their whole lives. And after my mom died, my dad never stopped crying. He told me at one point that he didn't cry most of his life. My dad has his own story and his own childhood trauma, right? And he said he'd never cry. He didn't even cry at his own parents' deaths. But when my mom died, he started crying and he couldn't stop. He cried a lot in the following years. He lived on his own, I think, for a couple of years. He didn't know how to feed himself. He was losing weight. And then he had a really, really bad situation with spinal stenosis, to the point where we finally decided that he needed to have surgery, and he had a spinal fusion, which was incredible success. It got him completely out of pain. Um, but there was a lot that came with that, with Parkinson's, and how long it took him to come out of anesthesia and rehab. He was supposed to be in rehab for, they told us, like, I think they told us, I don't know, up to 3 months. And my dad was there for 4 weeks. And wasn't, no, that's not true. He was not there for 4 weeks. He was there for 2 weeks. Um, and he just rocked rehab. And so then, but they sent us home, and I knew he couldn't be by himself. And so we got 24-hour care in there. And we'll talk, I'm sure, at some point about long-term care insurance and how we pay for these things and all this stuff. But we had 24-hour care with him. And at that point, he was willing to talk about assisted living. And so my dad, again, they lived about 45 or about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes north of me. And so I moved him down closer to me so that I could visit him. And I did all the move. I cleaned out my parents' home. Thankfully, it wasn't the home I grew up in. My parents had moved several years prior to that. They'd kind of downsized and gotten rid of a lot of things, which was great. But my dad had kind of gotten to that place where he was not throwing things away. His dining room table was just filled with organized bills, but he didn't know what to do with them after he had paid them. So he was an accountant by trade. And I knew that once he couldn't do the money part anymore, that we were advancing in a way that he was going to need more help. And so we moved him closer to me in assisted living. I did a lot of research. My gerontology degree came in really handy. Even so, you'll hear stories about assisted living too, as time goes on here. But yeah, we moved him to assisted living closer to me. I cleaned out their home. I sold their home. And that was in, I can't remember exactly when we moved him into assisted living, but he lived there for about a year and a half. And he got UTIs occasionally, and I had kind of gotten used to the idea of a UTI. He would get very confused. And in early October of 2015, he was having kind of what looked like an episode of a UTI. And so we got him into the hospital, and they came and told me that he was in kidney failure. And the doctor came into the ER. And I understand doctors, but not all of them have the best bedside manner. He came into the ER and said, "Your dad's in kidney failure. Does he have a DNR?" Which is a do not resuscitate, for those of you who may or may not know that. I was like, well, that's the way to find this out. So turns out there was a medication error that happened in assisted living, and I didn't know about it until it was too late, which is a longer story that I can get into some other time. But it was too late. And so that was October 3rd, and my dad died October 24th. And we brought him home with hospice. And he took a little longer to die. But the one thing I didn't mention is that I also grew up Catholic. And I think part of the Catholic part, I went to so many funerals because my mom was just like, this is what you do. You go to funerals. So I went to so many funerals of people I did not even know that just were in the church. And because I, for some reason, always got taken to these. I don't know if my brother was taken to these, but I was. And so I went to a lot of funerals, and they didn't feel foreign to me. So anyway, my dad was a very strong, devout Catholic until the day he died. I am no longer a practicing Catholic. I haven't been since I was early 20s. But once a Catholic, So I think my dad was that kind of person who, if there's a heaven, he went directly through. He's just a good person. I think everybody loved my dad. But my dad, I think, really had such a strong belief in his Catholicism that he just wasn't sure that he was going to heaven. And I think there was some fear, and it took him a long time to die. He talked to a lot of people while he was dying. It was a much different experience where my mom was out for a few days of just being completely comatose. My dad, it was over 2 weeks. Um, and long story of, spent nights there with my sister-in-law, administering morphine every 2 hours and all of the things. And I was there all the time. And so finally a day came and my husband was like, you need to go home. You need to go spend some time with your kids, get a shower. I'll be here today, and then you can come back tonight. And I had people lined up to stay with me. I had two friends stay with me the night before that. One of them, it was her birthday. And I thought for sure he was going to die when they were there. He did not. There was a lot of end of life breathing happening, and he was still not dying. Um, and so I went home that day and I thought for sure he was going to die while I was gone. I thought, okay, I just have to leave. Because we were doing all the things. We were playing music. We weren't playing music. We had candles. We didn't have candles. We talked to him. We didn't talk to him. We did all of the kind of things that people were telling us to do. And I just thought, maybe I just have to leave. Maybe he needs me out. So I was gone all day. I was waiting for my phone to ring all day long while I was doing stuff at home. I went back that night, that evening, late afternoon. I had a friend that was supposed to be coming to stay with me that night. And I walked into Dad's apartment and I, saw my husband, and I went in and I gave my dad a kiss like I did every time. And I took his pulse because that's my thing, I guess. And it was still beating strong. And I went out to pour myself a glass of wine. And as I poured it and I had it in my hand and I felt something brush my shoulder, and I knew he was gone. That was it. And I turned around, I went in there, and he was dead. And it was like I needed to come back. He needed me to be gone, and I needed to come back. And um, I don't know what happens to you after you die. I don't know what happens to any of us after we die. I don't have a huge belief system in what that is. But while we were with my dad and he was dying, it felt like there was so much energy in his apartment, like there were beings there. And when I felt that brush my shoulder, I knew he had left. And all of that energy just felt like it left the room. And it was just me and my husband. So I don't know. I don't know anything more than anybody else does, but I also had a couple of interactions with my parents after they died, which I will talk about probably some other time. But yeah, so I was with both my parents when they died, which I did not expect in my life. I was 40 when my mom died. I was 47 when my dad died. No, I was 41 when my mom died. Nope, I was 40. I was 40 when my mom died. I was 47 when my dad died. Nope, I was 46. See? Because they died 6 years apart. So yeah, I was 46. My mom's death date is October 13th. My dad is October 24th. October is a very complicated month for me. All these years later. This year it will be 16 for my mom and 10 for my dad. And yeah. 2015. Yes. 2025. So yeah, 16 for my mom and 10 for my dad. And it's still a very complicated month. And I don't know what I'm going to get in October, but I tell people all the time that our bodies remember the time of year when somebody dies, and through any trauma, really. But, if we're talking death and dying, our bodies remember. And I've always said that I could be at the bottom of a well and I would know when it was October. I'd be like, I think it's October up there. My body just feels it. So grief after my mom was complex because losing a mom is complex. And that's when I really got into all of this of what is grief? What does it feel like? What does it mean? What do I learn about myself? And that is when I learned so much about myself, was after my mom died. And I often say that I don't think I'd be the person I am today if my mom was still alive. And what I grieve over her now is the relationship I wish we could have had, and that I think we could have had, except I wouldn't be who I am if she was still alive. I wouldn't have learned the things I learned about myself and been able to give her the grace that I couldn't give her while she was alive. Um, and I'm older and all those things. And that's what I grieve is I think my mom and I could have had a really cool mother-daughter relationship, except the reason I believe that is because she died. So it's this weird paradox, right? And so when my dad died, I thought, I've done this grief stuff. I've been a grief counselor for a while now. I know how to do this stuff. And because my dad died from a medication error that I did not know about, I felt a lot of guilt. And guilt and grief are a dangerous combination. And the year after my dad's death is black for me. I would go to work, and that was the only place I felt okay because I could handle other people's stuff. And as soon as I walked out the door of my office, it just was a big black cloud that enveloped me. And it was a really, really, really hard year. Um, so you'll hear probably more bits and pieces of that along the way. I may come back on here at some point and do another episode, just me. Um, but I wanted to kind of give you the basics of my grief and my death experience. Also, just so I say it, I certified as a death midwife after my mom had died. They call it death doula now, but I did it so long ago that it was still called death midwifery. And I had intended to kind of be a death doula and be with people when they were dying. And what I realized was that I had done a lot of being on call for people for a long, long time in my life. I had been a birth doula for 15, 20 years. And that's not true. I couldn't have been maybe 15 years. And I just was over being on call for people. And so I've developed the work I do into, grief counseling and grief advocacy, death dying advocacy. I'm hoping to do more of that now that my kids are grown and living on their own. And that was a whole nother story. But that was probably the next big grief I experienced was when my kids left. And I'm still working through that because my oldest just left a year ago. My kids moved out backwards. So I had my two kids and I have my bonus son in the middle. And so they all were, they're now 23, 24, and 26. And so the youngest left first because he went to college. He left when he was 19. And then our middle one left. And then my oldest one left. He's now in college. And the amount of grief on that is a whole different level. And that we will talk about more because that is definitely a part of aging. And we'll talk about things like menopause and perimenopause in this podcast because that is part of aging. And there's a lot of grief involved in all of that. That will be a whole nother story. Maybe that will be my own episode one day again, too. I don't know. But I wanted to just kind of give you my story of death and grief because you're going to hear a lot of other people's stories. And so I just wanted you to kind of hear what my two experiences were with the death of my parents. I've had other random deaths. I've had animals die, and those are big stories in themselves. And, all of my grandparents and friends, just lots of different things. But those two experiences of losing my parents were really, really profound for me. Losing my second parent was just an experience I did not understand until I went through it. And I tell people this all the time. There is no way to explain to somebody what it's going to feel like to give birth to a baby. You have to experience it. There's no way to explain to somebody what it feels like to have your parents die until your parents die. There's no way to explain to somebody what it feels like to have your spouse die or a child die. I work with a lot of people who have had babies die. And that's hard. I mean, there's no other way around it, right? It's one of the things I feel very, very passionate about, that we need to talk about miscarriage and babies that die. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to admit those things happen, but they do. And those parents need to be able to talk about it. So we will talk about those things on this podcast. We will also say the word die. We will say death and dying and that people died. If my guests use the term passed away, I'm not going to take that away from anybody. But boy, I'm really going to push the word dying, that your parent died or this person died or, whatever. Because we've lost a relationship, but we haven't lost the person. We know where they are. That person died. And then we've lost a lot of other things because of it. So I'm going to really push the idea of we have to say the word die. Um, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of sense of me and what I'm hoping to do here. And I hope you tune in. My first guest, I'm really looking forward to sharing that episode with you. And I don't know what this looks like. I don't know who's going to be on here. I don't know who's going to come forward and decide they want to do this, but I'm looking forward to seeing what it looks like. So thanks for listening to me on episode 0. I don't know how long other episodes are going to be, but I'm hoping they're somewhere in the 30-minute to a half an hour range, or 30, that's the same thing, 30 minutes to an hour range. And again, probably mostly audio, but it's going to kind of depend on a client. If a client's okay with video, then maybe we do video. But welcome to Deathly Honest. And I'm glad you're here.